I want to mention something I'm sure you all know, which is the famous distinction made by C. Wright Mills in his book, The Sociological Imagination. That's the distinction between private troubles and public issues. And I think he was speaking, I'm not sure I remember this correctly, but I think he was speaking about studies that were made of people who were out of work, who had no work, during the Great Depression of the 1930s in the United States, and how they blamed themselves. They felt it's my fault because I don't have a job. And he said, of course, it was not their fault. It was the fault of the economy, which did not provide any jobs. There were no jobs for them to have. So it wasn't reasonable to think that it was my fault that I didn't have work. But you had to understand that the reason people were out of work was that the economy had failed. And Mills made of that a very general proposition, which of course is a wonderful sociological tactic, to take a specific case and say, what if this is true everywhere and for everything? In this case, the problems of being a graduate student. I have to write papers. I have to write a thèse. It's interesting to ask yourself, first of all, to recognize that this is not something that was given thousands of years ago, that everybody of a certain type has to write a thèse. That this is not a biblical, not an injunction from the Bible. Right? You don't have to do that. You have to do it because. And the reason is that you are involved in a grand social organization, an enormous social organization, which is the world of higher education. So in order to become part of that world, eventually it's necessary to do what the world requires. It appears in your life as a terrible problem, right? I have to do this thing. I've never written a thèse. I don't know how to write a thèse. I don't know anybody who will tell me how to write a thèse. So it's a great mystery. Well, all of those things are the result of certain features of social organization. Just to remind you of what you know, there is a big gulf between the teachers and the students. The teachers are also writing the equivalent of a thèse, something similar. They're writing a book. They're writing an article. Students do not see that. They don't see the teacher at work having the same problems. How can I write this? Where am I going to find something to say? How will I organize it? All the things that I described in this book, you know, Écrire les sciences sociales, that the students I worked with were worried about. How can I make sense out of what all these things I know? I know hundreds of things, discrete facts, I have ideas, but I don't know how to put it together, and I'm afraid I will never know. And I'm afraid also that when I show my work to people, they will laugh. They will not say, oh, how marvelous. No, they will laugh. They will laugh at me. So I described here in the first seminar that I taught about how to write, one of the people there who was not a student, was a professor somewhere. And she described, how, I asked them all to tell me, how do you write? All the details. What kind of paper do you write on? What kind of a plume do you use? What kind of a machine do you use? And everyone had a story that was a little bit crazy. Right? And she said, well, I can only write on paper which is yellow, which has lines, and I can only write with a pen that writes with green ink. I mean, what is that? And then, and she said also, I always write on the second sheet, not on the top sheet. So I said, why do you, I mean, I could not understand this. So I said, why do you do that? She said, if someone comes by and they looked at my paper, they would see what I wrote, and they might laugh. So I have the first paper, I pull it down, nobody sees what I wrote. Okay. Immediately I knew this was wonderful for me, not for her. But it was wonderful for me because now I understood, and I made a kind of theoretical analysis very quickly. I said, this is something like the anthropologist Malinowski described in his great book about magic in the Trobriand Islands. When do people make magic? Well, if they know in a rational way how to accomplish something, for instance, how to find their way in the ocean, they do it the rational way. But if they have no idea what to do, then they do magic. It's better than nothing. And that's what she was doing. She was doing magic, a green pen. Okay, so, but it was all private. This was the first time she had told anyone this. The other people in the room did not laugh because they knew me and they knew that I would insist that everyone tell their story. And they all knew that they had an equally crazy story to tell. So, and everyone did tell their story. I told my story. I can't remember now what my magic was at that time. But now I have other magic that I do. But it's still magic. But it was private. And so the great thing that my class accomplished is not that I explained how to do it, because I could not, but that they learned that everybody, that their worst fear was true. They were crazy. And it wasn't so bad because everyone else was crazy. And the craziness did not come from inside. The craziness came from the world they lived in, which was the world of the university, where the teachers did not show them anything but the last version that was as perfect as they could make it. So that was one thing. And the other, that it's all secret. People don't tell each other about these problems, so everyone thinks it's my problem instead of our problem. And the second thing is, I have to write a thèse. Why? Well, if I want to be a professional in this field, I have to have a degree. This is the way you get a degree. 3 or 4 or 5 people will decide whether my work is good enough. This is very frightening, because this is not the world of the profession. This is the world of school. In the real work of sociology or any other field, you write your article, you publish it somewhere, and it's addressed to the whole world. Everyone now can read your article. That's very different from having 4 people or 5 people who are the people who will judge and decide. Now you have the whole world to find allies, readers, people who agree, people who will argue with you. You can become part of the conversation of that professional world. Okay, but when you're a doctorant, you don't have that privilege. It's these people that you have to satisfy. And as we all know, sometimes they're very arbitrary. Sometimes you can't understand what they want. Sometimes what they want might be something that would be good for them, but maybe not so good for you, etc. I mean, all the possible things you can think of occasionally happen. In fact, most often they don't happen, because the teachers most of the time are very reasonable, nice people, and they're not trying to kill you, they're trying to help you. It might not seem like that, but they are trying to help. But in other words, the work you have to do must satisfy a very small audience. At the extreme, it's more extreme in before you get into the higher levels of university education, when you write papers for a class. And a great teacher of what in the United States is called English composition, that means writing. A great teacher of that subject described the paper you write for a class as a paper no one wants to write and no one wants to read. Well, that's a different kind of paper. Now you're writing something that you're afraid someone will read. And it's much harder. It's much more difficult. So the problems then arise from the social organization of higher education. Right? I have to do this, and I have to satisfy those people, and I have to do this under the condition that I have no idea how it's done, and I have no way to find out. That's really a terrible problem, and I don't blame anyone for being upset about this, for being bothered by that. So that's what I wrote this book for. I wrote that book to try and make the whole process and the whole problem less mysterious, to show people how it was part of the world of the discipline they were becoming a member of. And if you understand it that way, then it's like Mills telling the person who has no work, it's not your fault. That's not the problem. The problem is this is the way this world is organized. Now, you are a little bit in the position of the man without work, because he can't change the economy, and it's not very likely that you, even if you all join together to do something, and of course everyone here has the memory of 1968. I know this. Even if you didn't exist then, you know what they did. But in fact, really nothing changed that much in the French university system as a result of that. And people are still writing. You no longer write the thèse d'état, which was something really you could hardly lift. But now you write a smaller one, but still it's a serious thing, and it's just like it was. So that's the problem, and the problem for each of us is to know what to do, how to deal with that. Well, the answer to a question like that, there's not one answer. The answers depend on where you are, who you work with, what the conditions are that you have to meet, you can do some things. I mean, the things that Sebastian and Maurice have done, which is to open the discussion to everybody, to make sure that everyone can come and join and share their experiences and learn, at least in part, the lesson that Mills taught. You know, that it's not your fault. Well, what you're talking about is the difference. This is the other side of Mills. See, Mills is talking about problems and difficulties. You're talking about pleasures, right? And you might say that private pleasures can also become a public good. And, well, that's what, in the best circumstances, that's what graduate school does. It helps you to understand how you can take these private interests. I like to talk to people. I'm curious. I like to solve puzzles. You don't have to go to school to do those things. But if you go to school, you will learn how to do them in a way that's more organized, that allows you to engage more easily in a discussion with other people who think about these things. You don't have to go to become a sociologist or get a PhD to do that. And thank you, Sebastian. This book is about that. Comment parler de la société. Because many people do the same thing that we do. They call it art. They call it theater. They call it film. They call it writing roman. You know, they do it in a different way. It's possible to pursue those pleasures in a number of areas, in a number of arenas, a number of organizations. There are people, and you don't see this in social science because there's no way to see these people, but in the arts, there are often discoveries of what are sometimes called naive artists or primitive artists or just people who are amateur, right, who are not professionals. I mean, Douanier Rousseau was not a professional painter, you know. He was a fonctionnaire, but he liked to paint. And he painted pictures that came to the attention, finally, of people who were interested in the world, professional world of art. And they said, hey, this guy is good, right? We have to pay attention to him. I mean, that happens. But if you want to get into the world in which these kinds of pleasures and questions are discussed and worked on collectively, then you have to choose what collectivity you will join. Once you do that, you are in a world of social organization. Okay. So at the extreme, one answer is stay out of the social organization. Just do it, enjoy it, maybe write about it, maybe do like many poets have always done, which is to find a job doing something else, and then you do your serious work at night or some other time. There are many examples of this. One of the great American composers of music, Charles Ives, was never a professional musician because he felt the world of professional music was too constraining, wouldn't allow him to do what he wanted. So he went into the business of insurance, and he was the executive of a big insurance company. And when he wasn't doing that, he wrote music. Right? People do that. Other people, of course, say, I'm a professional. And they, like Stravinsky, they look for people who will support them, who will pay them to write music, pay them to play their music, etc. It's a different... And then they have to deal with the constraints that Ives refused to accept. Now, how to actually manage the interaction between what you find interesting and what this world finds interesting, I can't tell you. Because that's something you find by trial and error. You try something, it works, it doesn't work, you try something else, etc. I have been in the business of sociology for a very long time, so I've tried all sorts of things. Many of the things I tried didn't work. I'm sorry. I'm very sorry because I liked them, but they didn't work. So I'm enough of a professional that when it doesn't work, after a while I say, okay, that didn't work. I don't spend more time on that. Right? It's that kind of... so the answer is for you to find, because you're the only one who knows what will please you. So you have to do the experiments and find the answer. Il y a cette livre un truc qui s'appelle le truc de Bernie Beck. This trick always works. And what it says to you is take the case that you studied and remove some of the identifying marks. So if I said, my thesis is about the careers of teachers in the Chicago public schools, then my friend, Professor Beck, would say to me, okay, now tell me what your thesis is about, but you cannot use the word Chicago, you cannot use the word school, you cannot use the word teacher. Now, what is it about? And I found something to say. It's about careers. He allowed me this word. In a bureaucratic organization in which the jobs, the particular positions in the organizations are ranked in the eyes of the people looking for positions, so that they think this one is good, this one is not so good, this one is even better, this one is worse, this is the worst, etc. And there are methods for moving from one position to another. And this is how people manage their careers in this setting. And what I found then, I could say, is a case of lateral, as opposed to vertical, social mobility in a bureaucracy. Instead of, because the classic description of bureaucracy is there's a hierarchy of positions, right? And a career consists of moving from this position to this one, and so on. In this case, the teachers by the way, were very, very clear with me. They had no interest in, there was a hierarchy. They were not interested. They did not want to become the head of a school or an administrator in a central office. They wanted to go from this school, which had features they didn't like, to this school, which was better in those ways, that had students that were easier to teach, that had a head of the school who understood the problems of a teacher and supported the teacher when it was necessary, and so on. So I could move from this level of very specific. In Chicago, there are these problems with these schools, and these teachers do this. Now I could say, I can talk about not just teachers, but anybody in a bureaucratic organization. And I can talk about careers that not only go this way, but that go this way. And if Beck insisted, what if he said to me, no, you can't say bureaucracy? Would I still have something to say? Yes, because there is a process of career movement, of moving from one organization to another, which occurs not only in bureaucracies. Bureaucracy is the clearest case, but it's not the only case. The musicians that I wrote my master's thesis about also had careers, and they moved from one position to another. They moved more often. I mean, sometimes every week, because there were no fixed positions. If you worked someplace for 6 months, it was very unusual. So I could have done that too. Now, the problem about generalizing my case is always that you're asked to do this when you start. Right? You're asked to do this, and I hear students in the United States, and I'm sure people say this here in some form, I'm going to use Weber in my thesis. I say, you're going to use Weber? I mean, which part of Weber? Which idea? Oh, well, I haven't decided yet. And very good, because it's not possible to decide that. But maybe Weber will not be the best one. I mean, that happens. I wrote a paper some years ago, which I called How Much is Enough? I didn't start with a theoretical idea. I started with a problem. There had been some years earlier an enormous snowstorm in Chicago. The city was paralyzed for several days and for weeks afterward, really, because it was not prepared to deal with the amount of snow that fell. They did not have enough machines. They didn't have enough people. They didn't have a plan. By the time they did something, they had managed to bury half the automobiles in Chicago under snow while they cleared out the streets. And it was just a gigantic mess. So I thought, well, that, and then there was also the problem of a heat wave. How do you say this? I know this word.
Vague de chaleur.
Canicule, because I remember the canicule here, where the same questions arose. We should have done more. We should have had more help for people, etc. And the question always arises in the case of a disaster of this kind, how much should we have? Because I remembered being in Montreal during a snowstorm that would have, it started to fall the day that I was supposed to leave and go back to California. And I thought, oh, I'm here for 4 days that I didn't plan. No. The snow hardly started when the machines were on the street. They were picking it up. It never got higher than this in the places where it was important. They had more. They were ready for more. So the question was, how much preparation is enough? Then I began to look for other cases. I live in San Francisco. San Francisco has tremblement de terre. It's not a secret. Everybody knows that someday we are going to have what people who live there call the big one. Something terrible is going to happen, as happened in 1906, when the entire city burned down. That probably won't happen, because they did make preparations. But how big of an earthquake should you be ready for? Because the problem is that the money the state or the city or you personally spend on preparations for these disasters is taken from someplace else where you could have spent it. Education for the children, help for older people, etc. All kinds of things that could be done. Better medical facilities. Then I began to generalize the problem. I first mentioned this publicly at a dinner party here in Paris. And my hostess immediately said, well, I have another interesting question for you. This was a social scientist. She said, how many pairs of shoes are enough for a woman to have? And there was a big discussion. The men were slightly puzzled, but not completely. And she went around the room and insisted that everybody say, how many shoes do you have? Everybody knew. That was the first result, the first finding. Everybody knew that, etc. Anyway, it's a long story, but I ended up being interested in how many languages should be saved, right? How many species should be saved. There's all kinds of questions that are formally similar to this. And then I thought, now I need a general theoretical idea. Okay? Can you guess where I found it? It should be obvious. Durkheim was suicide, right? The idea of anomie, when people when they have more than they need and they don't know how to spend it. And conversely, when they have less, what do they do? I mean, it's the whole problem of allocating resources that Durkheim put in a very cogent way. So that's how I try to find the general case the general version of what I'm working on. It has the difficulty that you can't tell anybody else what your general idea will be until you're through. But and as a person writing a thèse, you don't have that privilege. What you can do is lie. As you say, yes, I'm going to use these ideas. Okay. It's a matter of simple observation that if you write a good thèse, no one ever looks at the proposal that you made. No one says, oh, you said you were going to do this and you use this instead. No. So it's not a problem. Just make something up, treat it as an exercise, and then do your research and find the idea you really need. See, this is me being a very mauvais garçon. If you use récit de vie, you will have plenty of serendipity. I guarantee this. Because when you let things happen, see, the problem with a lot of social science research is we don't allow people to tell us what they have to tell. We ask them a question, what do you think about? Then we tell them the topic. Maybe that isn't the topic. Maybe they think about that topic in different words. They don't recognize the topic you propose to them. When you observe in a real life situation, people do all sorts of things, things you didn't expect. Now, if you're really a strict person who believes in establishing your method and following it, you ignore all those things. A friend of mine who I worked with closely for a few years had been trained in experimental psychology. So he worked with rats. And you know the standard psychological experiment is you put the rat in a maze and you reward the rat for taking one path in the maze with a piece of cheese, fromage, and if he takes the wrong path, you give him an electric shock. And this is how you train them to do whatever you want them to do. And Jim said to me one day, you know, I did a lot of those experiments with rats. He said, all you read in the article I wrote, or that anybody writes, is the rat turned right or the rat turned left. He says, but you know, that's the last thing they do. They do 100 things before they get there. They stop, they turn around, they look over their shoulder, they smell everything. They try to climb the wall. He said they do so many interesting things that nobody is interested in. So because that's not, we don't allow that part of their communication to exist for our purposes. So any method of research that lets people do what they want, say what they want, in the words they want, is very helpful to us because it tells us, aha, here's something you didn't know. In the book Tricks of the Trade, there's a ficelle de métier, there's a long story, which I'm not going to repeat, about the medical students I worked with and how I discovered the meaning of a slang, an idiomatic term that they used to describe medical patients. They called somebody a crock. And for me, that was something to follow because I didn't understand it. I didn't know what they meant. They understood what they meant. I didn't. So I had to get them to explain it to me. And there's about 6 or 8 pages telling how that happened, because although they knew what it meant, they couldn't explain it to me. It was such an intuitive notion for them that they couldn't put it into words, although they could apply it reliably. So I used that and I enlisted them as my assistants. Help me find out what this word means, because you use it, so you must know. So let's work on this together, a little scientific study. And they were very interested, and it provided one of the important insights that shaped the rest of our book. So that's not really a problem, as long as you allow people to do what they would do, say what they would say. The problem of teaching, really, especially with younger students who are not, after all, necessarily interested in becoming a sociologist, is to have them be interested at all. Right? They have to take a class. We know they must take some class. So the question is, for them, and my colleagues and I wrote a book about undergraduate students, which is about seen from what undergraduate education looks like if you're an undergraduate student. Sometimes they are actually interested in a topic. They want to learn about it. Some of those students find that the course is not helpful. It's a distraction. It's not what they want to learn, etc. But mostly they took it because they have an opening in their program at 10 o'clock, and they looked at the courses at 10 o'clock, and this seemed to be the least undesirable. I mean, I don't mean to joke, really, because they have a problem. They have a problem of what's required. I have to have one of these and one of those and two of those, and they're not all offered every term, and this one is already full. And you know, it's a little bit like doing a puzzle. So there they are in your class. Some of them really are interested, others not. I have, and now I'm just going to speak personally, because I don't recommend that anybody have the same desires and ideas. I always want to teach a class that teaches people how to do something. Can be how to read a book, how to read a scientific article. Can be that. It can be how to gather information, how to use information to develop an idea. Those are all things you can teach people to do. I never say I want to teach them urban sociology, right, or anything like that. If I want to teach them field work, for many years I taught a class in field work for beginning graduate students. And the thing that shocked them, because they had just finished undergraduate school, and they were accustomed to being given a syllabus with a list of topics and a list of readings. This week we read this, next week we read this, etc. The first day, I didn't give them any paper, and many of them were upset. What I did was to give them an assignment, and the assignment was find some place where you can talk to people and watch them doing something, and then go there and talk to them and watch them, and then write everything down that you saw and heard and give it to me at the next meeting of the class. And I promise, this is the hard part, this is where the hard work was, that whatever you write, I will read and make comments. That is a lot of work. But I didn't have to prepare any lectures, right? I didn't have to read anything special. And so when I told them this, the first thing they said was, oh, I'm not ready to choose something. I said, no, of course not. And you never will be ready to choose something. So that doesn't matter. Choose something. They said, no, I can't do that. I said, well, I'm not allowing anyone to leave this room until they tell me what they're going to do. Now, of course, they could have left the room. I wouldn't have stopped them, but they understood I was serious. So finally they began to discuss what they would study. And then it became very interesting, because then you could ask serious questions. I want to study this organization. Well, do you know where its office is? No. Well, if you find out where its office is, what will you do? Oh, I'll go there. Yes. And then what will you do? I don't know. I want to go to this place. Will they let you in? Is it a place that has a wall and a fence and a gate and someone at the gate who says, can I see your identification? Can I see your carte d'identité? Aha. They didn't think of that. So all of those immediate practical questions came up. Then they went, they did something. The next day, they gave me what they wrote. And I said, without looking at them, I said, it's not enough. So then they knew that their teacher was crazy. And this is what they would have to deal with for 9 weeks. And so we discussed how much you had to write down. And I insisted for a long time, everything. Until one day I had a student who came in the first day. She wrote everything. I said, okay. Because what you have to learn is what part of it you're going to use. And you don't know what part you're going to use until you have it. You can say, no, this part is, I don't need this. So in the meantime, they wanted to know, well, is there something I should read? And at the beginning I said no. Because my experience was, if I told them something to read, they would say, I'm sorry, I didn't have time to do the field work because I didn't finish the reading. So I didn't allow that to happen. There was no required reading. But after 2 or 3 weeks, I would say to somebody, oh, you're interested in that? You know, you should read this article. You should read this book. If you look in Street Corner Society, you'll find something that's very interesting, if that's the question you have. Not always something famous or important, just things I knew that I thought would help them in some way, so that the whole course every year was invented. Now, of course, if you do this for 5 years, there are not a million original problems that arise. After a while, you understand there are families of problems, and there are things you can tell them a little more generally that will be useful to read, but not at the beginning. So I guess if I were teaching your class, I would make sure they understood that the note that you gave them would depend very much on how much observation they did and how much field notes they wrote. That would be the important thing. If they did that, you would be happy and they would get a good note. Because the one thing I did learn from studying undergraduates is that for them, the currency, the money of the world they live in is the notes, right? In the place we studied, almost everything that a student could want depended on their grades. I mean, to a degree that was really shocking to me. I wasn't so much older than them, but I discovered, for instance, that the people they could date, the potential romantic partners, depended on their grades, their notes. The first time I heard two young women say that, I thought, I can't believe this. I mean, I know these are serious students, but that serious? No. This was a typical American campus where people came from a very wide geographical area to this one town where the university was. And they didn't know people. They had left their high school. So all their old friends, some of them would be there, but most people would be strangers. And so they looked forward to meeting new people. And what these young women meant, because I asked them, I said, what are you talking about? This is not recommended fieldwork procedure usually to be so confrontational. I said, I can't believe what you just said. They said, and then they treated me like a stupid child, and they explained. And one of the many times I learned that being stupid is a wonderful thing to be in the field when you do this kind of work. They said, look, please understand, if he has bad grades now, he may fail. If he fails, he won't be here next year. I don't want to get involved with someone who won't be here next year. And I want to stop that before it starts, right? So it's obvious. He may be cute. I don't care. Right? If he's failing his courses. So this is what you have to work with. and you have to, I mean, they will understand that, I'm sure. Well, I hesitate to tell my colleagues what they should do. I don't think they would thank me for doing that. But in fact, every teacher has his or her own way of doing that. I can only tell you stories, possibilities. My mentor was a professor at the University of Chicago named Everett Hughes. Everett Hughes, I sometimes think of myself as an anthropologist. And you know that anthropologists, one of the things they do is to find the lineage of descent, the line of descent. Hughes was a student of Robert E. Park, who was one of the great founders of American sociology. Park was a student of Zimmel, George Zimmel. So I trace my descent from Zimmel to Park to Hughes to me. Other people had different, even though we were in the same department, my old colleague Irving Goffman had a different line of descent because his mentor was an anthropologist named Lloyd Warner. Warner was a student of Radcliffe Brown. And Radcliffe Brown, the British anthropologist, was a disciple, in a way, of Durkheim. So it was a different descent. But what I learned from Hughes was a way of working. He didn't ever teach me how to do these things, but he said things that were very influential. When I began my research for my dissertation. It was I did a research about school teachers in the schools of Chicago, and I interviewed the teachers, and then I would write my notes, detailed verbatim accounts of what the teacher had said to me, who I was talking to, and I would give him the interview. And after I gave him, and he would write notes that were very interesting and very useful. He would ask questions. You should have asked about this. This is something to ask in the next interview, etc. He used the first interviews to help me improve what I was doing. But one day I gave him the interview and he looked up at me, and he could be very abrupt. He said, "Why are you giving me this?" I said, "I thought I was supposed to." He said, "You know how to do this. Don't bother me with this." So when you're all done and you start writing, then we can talk. So I learned something from that I could do it myself. The teacher didn't have to hold my hand and take me down the road. That was a very important lesson. He taught me another very important lesson when I was finishing, when I was writing the thèse about school teachers. He looked up from his desk one day and said, "It's about time that you wrote an article." I hadn't thought of myself as someone who could write an article. He said, "No, you have to write an article." I said, "What shall I write about?" He said, "Well, you wrote your master's thesis about musicians. Write something about that." Okay. But, it was 100 pages. What shall I write? He said, this was a wonderfully useful idea for me. Take one idea in your master's thesis, and any other idea that you can attach to it in a way that makes sense to a reader, put that in. If you can't find a way to do it, leave it out. He solved one of the major problems that we all have, like what should be in this and what do I leave out? He said, if it sticks, okay. If it doesn't, no. It's a very simple rule, but a very useful one. And over the years I worked with him, I learned other rules like that. I think the most important thing a mentor can do is show you how to do the everyday work, not how to have an idea. Everybody has ideas. We all have ideas. But how to take an idea seriously and work with it. That's what he showed me. That's probably the most important thing I learned from him. I feel sure, although I have no way of knowing, that he learned that from Robert Park. I don't know where Robert Park learned it. Probably not from Zimmel. I don't think the relations between students and professors in German universities, when Park wrote his PhD thesis, were quite of that kind. But he had worked in the newspaper business. He had been a reporter. He had been an editor of a newspaper. So I think he learned things that way, which then came into sociological practice through him. Okay, that's one kind of thing that a teacher can do, that a mentor can do. Another thing that they can do, and some don't, is to do two things simultaneously. Tell you when you're going wrong, when you're doing something that will probably not work, will probably not be useful, and also to tell you when you're doing something right. Some teachers only like to tell you when you're doing something wrong. That's not useful. It just discourages you. It makes you unhappy. But also telling you only when you do something right is not useful, because we all do many things that are not going to work. And one of the things that is really important is to learn when to stop following an idea and to say, this idea is not working. I can't find the thing that I'm looking for. Maybe it's not there. It's very useful to learn that the idea you had was wrong. Because when you learn it's wrong, you learn that something else is right. Right? What's left is right. What's wrong, okay, get rid of that. Now, one of the problems about the social organization of higher education is that we almost always are told we must plan our research very carefully in advance. I never wrote a thesis in the hard sciences, in physics or chemistry or biology. So maybe it's important when you, I'm sure it is, when you plan an experiment to do all the thinking. Although it probably helps to try a few things first to see what might work and what probably won't work. But when you're doing work in social science, you can't work that way. You can't say, I'm going to take a sample of so many people who have these characteristics, and I'm going to ask them these questions, and I'm going to analyze the data in this way, which is what we're often asked to do when we write a research proposal. Now, the professors, the senior researchers, also have to do that because they write research proposals, which go to the Agence Nationale de Recherche and other such organizations where they're judged by colleagues. If the colleagues are smart, they know that this is only talk, that the real research will not be like this, because it can't be. If I knew before I started exactly how to do the research, I would know the results of the research. I wouldn't have to do it, because the way you do the research rests on a knowledge of the thing you're studying. When I studied school teachers, I knew very little about the career of a school teacher. I didn't know. I mean, I had gone to school in the elementary and high schools in Chicago, so I knew what it was like to be a student, but I had no idea what the life of a teacher was, what the problems of a teacher were. And so I had to find all that out. And so every interview I did told me something that I hadn't known, that I built into the next interview. I could not have made a list of questions to ask before I started. I could only make the perfect list of questions when I was through, right? In a way, the result of my research was a list of questions to which I had some answers that were, you could say, provisional, that is, subject to change. Okay, so that's something else that a teacher can teach you. Now, I don't know if you meant this, but many people would mean this by asking a question like that. Can I expect them to help me find a position after I graduate? It's a very reasonable question. I learned a difficult lesson. Some professors at the University of Chicago, where I was a student, worked very hard to find jobs for their students. Hughes did not do that. He did nothing to help me find a job. At the time, I was resentful. I thought that was terrible. now, many years later, I feel it was a very good thing, because it was just as happened when he told me, when he asked me, why are you giving me these interviews to read? You know how to do this. He was telling me, find out how to find a job. That's part of getting a job, is learning how to do it. And I can't tell you, he said none of this. But he said, I can't tell you because I don't know what it's like now to look for a job. The whole idea of a professor helping you to find a job rests on a situation that no longer exists. It was just dying, this possibility, when I finished my PhD, which was that there would be networks of influence and of patronage, you would have like a parent, right, who took care of you. And I remember hearing one of the senior professors at Chicago talking to the head of a sociology department somewhere in the country and saying to him, Forrest, it's nice to talk to you. This was one of his students who was now the head of a department. I have a very fine young sociologist to recommend to you. And then he mentioned one of my colleagues who got that job. Okay. Well, that doesn't exist. Now everything is competitive. There are rules, and it simply can't be done that way. I don't know. In France, I'm sure there are still influence being exerted, but I don't know exactly how it works. I'm glad I don't know. I don't want to know. There are other ways they can help you, things like helping you find an outlet for the things you write, a place to publish, and so on. But you know all that. The other things I think that I mentioned are more important. I can't resist the temptation to say, this is a terrific subject for a PhD thesis. Because it is. We all have guesses. Everything you mentioned and many other things. For many people, it's a way of pushing forward a research program. For my spiritual grandfather, Robert Park, it's very evident in his career that he arrived, maybe you know the story of Robert Park, it's a very wonderful story. He came from a very wealthy family in a smaller city in the Middle West. He went to Harvard, studied with William James, the great psychologist. Then he went to Germany. It was very common in those days to study with the great German social scientists, and studied with Zimmel and others. And he came back to the United States and did not continue in the academic world. He went into the world of newspapers. He worked for many years doing that. Then he became the assistant to one of the great black leaders, political leaders of the era, Booker T. Washington. And in fact, wrote some of his books and so on. He was 50 years old when he met W.I. Thomas. It's another great name in the history of American sociology. And Thomas thought he was very interesting, and Thomas was a professor at the University of Chicago, and he invited Park to come to Chicago to teach for one semester. And Park came, and there's a wonderful story about Park was not careful in the way he dressed, we can say. And Thomas thought it was because he was poor and had no money, so he took Park out and bought a new suit for him, which Park allowed him to do, even though he could have easily bought it himself. And so Park arrived at the University of Chicago, and he had a plan, which he wrote. He wrote a brilliant paper called "The City as a Laboratory for the Study of Human Behavior." And it's an incredibly detailed set of ideas about how you would study a city. All of Hughes's work, for instance, and as a result so much of my work, comes from one sentence in that paper, where he says in passing, in the city, every kind of work tends toward the model of a profession. He doesn't say anything more than that. Hughes spent, 40 years investigating that idea. Okay, what Park did is he got to Chicago, and every one of his students worked on something that Park was interested in. That's partly because Park was capable of being interested in a lot of things. So he could be interested in everything. And many of the dissertations were published as books. And in each case, Park wrote a preface to the book which explained his interest, like why he thought it was interesting that Andrew Lind wrote a book about Hawaii as a place where races and ethnic groups mixed. Why Louis Wirth's study of the ghetto was important. He had a reason why each of these was important. And it's clear that he considered, it wasn't just students. I mean, there's a 3-volume history of Chicago written by someone in the history department who probably would not have written that otherwise. There were many studies of politics and political organizations in Chicago. So everything was done in Chicago is the most studied city in the world as a result of this. It included all kinds of statistical studies, geographical studies, etc. So that's the extreme of what you're talking about. Right? He had an idea, and everybody didn't have to, but he must have, I imagine him as being exactly the embodiment of Weber's idea of charisma. That I never met him. I never saw him. This is a great regret. But clearly, if you met him, you probably would end up working on some idea of his. Okay, that's one reason. Another reason is more, you might say, political, in the sense that I want to establish a school of thought. I want my people to be distributed around the country, the world, in my profession. And so I train them, and then I try to find places for them where they can work on our program. You can furnish your own examples from the history of French sociology. I think there are quite a few. But in the United States, perhaps the most obvious ones were the people at Columbia University just before, during, and after World War II, Robert Merton and Paul Lazarsfeld, and the father of ethnomethodology, Harold Garfinkel, both of whom pursued these strategies quite consciously, with greater or lesser success. That's another reason. But the real answer is it would be a terrific project, and somebody should do that. Find out what all the answers are, because now I'm just playing a game, which, you know, this is what we do in seminars and things. We invent data and we invent answers, but we don't know if it's right. To do that, we have to go do the work. I never really participated in a laboratoire. We have research centers in the United States, not quite like the great laboratoire that the CNRS had for many years, still has. My own personal participation in a laboratoire was really the 1 month I spent in the laboratoire of Raymond Moulin, the Centre pour la Sociologie de l'Art. That was a wonderful place to work. I was only there a month, but there were many interesting people who I became friends with and who I still am close to, whose work I read, and from whom I learned a lot. And that was, I could see, for me, that was an ideal of what a laboratoire could be. In the United States, they tend to be more, I was part of one at Northwestern, but it was a very large one, and it was essentially a bureaucratic convenience that has allowed certain kinds of work to get done that otherwise would have been somewhat more difficult. And it wasn't really an organization in a more serious sense. A little bit, but I wasn't part of it. So I don't really know. I've never directed one, and so far I've been very lucky because I also was never the head of a department. I understood when I was quite young that if you did that, you didn't do sociology. The time you spend with the paper is not time doing sociology. There is no pleasure of the kind. Some people enjoy it, I understand. I'm not one. So I always avoided it, sometimes in terrible ways. I lied. I would say anything to avoid being head of a department or director of a laboratory. The people who do it well are saints, right? And they deserve all the rewards that it's possible for them to have. But most people don't do it very well. That's the problem. The ones who do are, in my experience, are very good sociologists because they don't try to make things happen that will not happen. They understand what's possible, how to work with what you have, and to make it happen. But no miracles. So I think what's more interesting is not an official laboratory. You know, the one who wrote best about this is really Paul Lazarsfeld, because he had the idea very early of a research center. I don't know exactly what he had in mind as the model, but he was very thoughtful about this. I was going to say something else. I can't remember. Oh, yes, right. The informal group is, you can have the equivalent of a laboratory without the bureaucracy. When I was at Northwestern, one of my close associates was a man named Charles Reagan, who some of you might know. He's the inventor of a mathematical method of analysis of qualitative data called qualitative comparative analysis, QCA. I think it's one of the most interesting possibilities that we have. It always surprised people that Charles and I were so close, but in fact we thought in a very similar way, although he usually worked with large data sets of a statistical kind. But we decided one day we should see if anybody else was interested. So we put a sign up in the department, informal group going to meet to talk about qualitative research, Reagan and Becker. And we're going to meet at this time in this room. About 15 students and a couple of faculty members appeared. And that was the beginning of what we called a workshop. And the most important feature of the workshop for us was that it had no formal existence. We got no money from the department to do this. We didn't get credit for teaching a class. We just did it. And the students came or didn't come. You know, whoever was interested came there. It went on for a number of years. And in fact, other faculty members liked the idea, so they had workshops. And now, in that particular department, there's a sort of shadow curriculum. There's the courses, and then there's the workshops, which have some sort of, and I think now they do get money to bring speakers and so forth. But easy to do, easy to join, easy to stop being a member. That's the way, in fact, most work gets done, I think, in any of the sciences, or at least in ours. The first thing I would say is that it's necessary to be very realistic about all these things. The first part of realism is to understand that the word hegemony is usually misapplied. There are very few instances in which someone really monopolizes everything. Now, you know, I know the United States, the situation well, and I know that it doesn't apply in the way that people think it does there. I know the situation in France much less well, but I have many suspicions that it's not quite as bad as I'm told. And the reason is that people, no one ever offers me evidence. They offer me instances, examples. And to be sure, there have been people in both of these academic worlds that have exercised a lot of power, right? People say to me in the United States, well, I have to publish in the American Sociological Review, in the American Journal of Sociology, or everything is lost. Well, it's clearly not true. And the truth of it can be seen in people who find very good positions at very good universities who haven't published in those places because there's such a wealth of journals now, of reviews. For instance, if I do sociology of science, I don't publish in the American Sociological Review. That's not the important place for me. There are 2 or 3 other journals in science studies that are really important, and so on. In sociology, we write books as well, and many people, the dissertation results in a book, not in an article in a journal, a review of this kind, but in a book. The market for books is very different. In a journal, you're dealing, it's a little like the situation of writing a thèse, because you have a very small group who decide on the fate of your article. And like in the United States, those 2 journals have become famous for enforcing what I regard as a completely insane kind of standard about what constitutes a publishable article. I did an experiment. It's in one of these books. I think it's in Comment parler de la société. The experiment was the editor of one of those journals asked me about 8 or 9 years ago to submit an article to his journal. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that. No, you should do it. I said, why should I do it? Oh, because he said, we'll be fair. You know, we're not prejudiced against the kind of work you do. I said, well, I will bet you $1,000 that I will give you an article that I consider really good, and you will reject it. So, well, he didn't want to bet, which was the first sign. So, but I said, okay, we'll do the experiment. I had in mind, in the book I wrote called Le Monde de l'Art, it begins with the case of Anthony Trollope, the famous British romancier, who at the height of his fame decided to make an experiment and to submit 2 stories to a magazine that had published Trollope's work often under another name, to give a false name. Because he said he wanted to see how much of his success was due to his name and how much to the quality of the work. And he was, I think, a little disappointed but not surprised that both of these stories were rejected. One of them remarking on the similarity to the work of Anthony Trollope, and both of them saying that the stories were very promising and that he should keep working, and in a few years he would probably be ready to publish. Okay, so I had that in mind. So I sent them the article, which is a chapter in the other one. In this book, it's the chapter about I can't find the table de content, but it's a chapter about Irving Goffman's language. This is a paper that I really think is very good for me. I mean, it's one of the papers I'm proud of. In Irving Goffman, Langage et stratégie comparative. Okay. I think this is a pretty good paper. I was pleased with it. I didn't send him something that no one else wanted. And he sent it, as he was required to do, to 3 people to read. And all three wrote the same report, essentially. First of all, they knew immediately it was me. I didn't try to hide it. In fact, I spoke of my connection with Goffman. And I did not cite a lot of literature about either the problem of the language in which research is reported, or, as I was told, I had failed to mention the Goffman literature. I knew that there was a small industry devoted to explaining Goffman, which most of which I wasn't familiar with and had no intention of reading because I didn't think it would be relevant. And so they said, it's a really interesting paper. They said, so many good ideas. But he doesn't mention the Goffman literature, and also it's written in this kind of, I don't know what the word would be en français, offhand, so très informel. It doesn't sound, one of them said, like a ASR article. That is to say, the format is so strict now that it must be like this or else it's not one of ours. And so they said, it's really too bad because it's so interesting, but we can't publish this. And the editor sent it back to me and said, I don't suppose you'd be interested in revising it along these lines. And no, of course not. I was very sorry that he hadn't taken the bet. I would have been very happy. We could have had many good dinners here with that money. But that's the kind of problem. But there's plenty of others. There's other reviews. I mean, and it's not just me. You know, they say, oh, Becker, he can publish anywhere. No, he can't, first of all. Now, this is proved. QED. And there are other places that I can publish. And that's true for everybody. So the hegemony, it's not hegemony. The power, of course, exists. People have control of some things. No one has control of everything that I know of. Maybe, you know, maybe there's somewhere here there is a secret cabal that has this kind of monopoly control, but I don't think so. I mean, I think of a wonderful researcher and author, Jean Peneff. Jean Peneff has written a large number of very good books, including two beautiful works of travail de terrain on l'urgence médicale. I mean, Jean is fond of saying that he never accepted or looked for 1 centime of subvention de l'État. He was able to do his research without that. The books were published by Découverte. Ce n'est pas mal. You know, it is possible. It's a big problem to know when you are finished, when you are through. A friend of mine once invited me to give a talk to his department, and he wanted to know the title. So I said, the title of my talk will be The 3 Things That Every Sociologist Must Know. And they thought, oh boy, this is going to be the real secrets. And I said, okay, the 3 things are how to start. I said, that's not a problem because whatever you choose, you have already started. Because you have ideas about it, you have thoughts. So you just have to realize what you have already done. And then you have to know, well, I said, then you have to know how to finish, how to be through. And the third one is what to do in between those 2 points. I said it's easy. Right. How to stop is really, really difficult because there is no end. There really is not an end to anything anyone does. There's a very interesting book by a sociologist of science. I think it's Peter Gallison who wrote a book called How Experiments End. And he says they don't, because an experiment is just part of a series. And it ends when you decide it's enough, I'm stopping. And that's the way every scientific work ends, right? You finally say, ça suffit. I'm through, right here, I stop. Knowing that there are questions you have not answered, there are problems that you just realized, you just yesterday understood are really important. You don't know what will happen when people read about what you think about what they do. You could wait. No. En jour donné, you say, I'm through. It's totally arbitrary. There's no logic. There's no good reason to stop anywhere. You just stop. And you stop for practical reasons. My bourse ran out. I don't have any more money. I have to finish. I have a new job to start. Right? I have to finish this now, etc. Those are the reasons people finish things. Practical reasons. Not good scientific reasons. Because if you look at, as I said, at natural science, when the zoologists who sit in the jungle and watch the animals coming to the water hole and make their notes, when do they stop? Usually they stop when it's time to go home. They have a ticket, right? I'm leaving, goodbye. Because you never know what might happen tomorrow. Something different. And in fact, things always happen tomorrow. The situation changes. One of the things that Robert Faulkner and I learned doing our book about jazz, Qu'est-ce qu'on joue maintenant, is that the world that we grew up in of les musicaux ordinaires, as Mark Perrineau calls them, ordinary musicians who play anything. The world that we grew up in doesn't exist anymore. Everything that we learned to do is a little bit not so useful now. The world has changed. There are different kinds of venues where people play, different audiences that have different desires. We weren't paying attention in our own lives except to treat this as trouble. Right? Oh, these people don't know the right songs. What's wrong with them? Instead of seeing that as a sign of history. Things are changing. Right? So wherever you stop, it was too soon. Because historically, everything will change. We come back to Paris each year, to the same quartier. It's surprising how much things have changed. This store closed, this one opened. This little cafe used to be no one there. Now it's very branché. I mean, that's the metabolism of urban life. So that's not help. It doesn't help you. But it's the truth. I hope that's provocative. I always like to be provocative. Je suis un mauvais garçon.